Joining me now, Mervin Jebaraj, economist with the University of Arkansas Walton College of Business. He's also the director of the Center for Business and Economic Research. Mervin, good to have you with us.
Yeah, happy to be back.
We are seeing some preliminary first quarter statistics. We're seeing some earnings reports. We're seeing some economic data that's out there. What is it telling you about, say, business investment, consumer confidence, and strength of the economy?
Yeah, so far we have sort of a divergence of reports we have in for different reasons than in the previous years. In previous years, we've again had uh, you know pessimistic reports from soft data like consumer sentiment surveys, but then the hard data like employment growth and GDP growth has always been fairly stellar. That is still the case. The difference now is that consumers are even more pessimistic on some of the soft data. So you look at consumer sentiment surveys. You look at business confidence indices that the Federal Reserve puts together. Both of these indicate that businesses and consumers are very concerned about the state of the economy, especially looking forward. But then the actual hard data that we have so far for the first quarter of this year, keep in mind that we're almost to June now and to the end of the second quarter. But for the first quarter of this year, the employment reports, the inflation reports, and the GDP growth has been okay. The employment growth has been about 177,000 jobs each month on average. That is not terribly far from where we were last year. Our long-term economic, employment growth was about 180 or more thousand jobs each month. The inflation report is getting a lot closer to the Federal Reserve's target, although that might, just be the effect of lower gas prices in the reference period that was surveyed. The piece that was negative, obviously, was GDP growth for the first quarter. Almost all of that was explained by actions businesses and consumers took to avoid the tariffs that they knew were coming, even though they didn't quite know the size and scale of it. So keep in mind the tariff announcements started in March for Canada, Mexico, and China, and then really broadened on April 2nd. So April 2nd, especially, is outside of that first quarter GDP report. So we saw a lot of importing in the first quarter to front run the tariffs, and businesses importing a lot of equipment, especially electronic equipment, computers that would have been subject to tariffs starting on April 2nd, and consumers buying what they really love, which is cars in March, which really boosted consumer spending, without which consumer spending would have been lower as well.
So this is all obviously centered around trade and how the U.S. trades with a lot of foreign countries. We have seen um, the United Kingdom has come to the table and cut a deal with the United States. I want to ask you a little bit about what you see in that. That is not an unimportant trade relationship, but it's not one of the biggies. The biggie would be U.S. and China. And I think we have a cooling off period for 90 days, but at least both sides have agreed to dial it back a little bit. Is China the big one to watch? What are you kind of seeing in some of these preliminary moves that are made between UK, US, and China?
Well, as you mentioned, the trade relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom is not very big at all. It's more important as a political relationship. And keep in mind also that the United Kingdom has been looking for a trade deal with the United States since they left the European Union. So since Brexit, they have a more broad trade agreement with India that they also reached in the last couple of weeks. This one is not a trade agreement because that would have to be authorized by Congress. This is just an agreement to reduce tariffs on a few different items. So we're cutting back on some of the tariffs on cars and aluminum and steel, and they're cutting back tariffs on ethanol from the US and cutting back tariffs on beef, although they did not remove the requirement that keeps beef that has had growth hormone in it out of the United Kingdom. So it's a very limited agreement on a few items. But I think what is indicative in the agreement with the United Kingdom is that even countries that come to the table and agree to a variety of different measures in the United States still end up with roughly a baseline of 10% tariffs across a wide variety of goods. Um, and so, as other countries are thinking about negotiating somewhere before that 90-day deadline ends up, they would have to assume that the effective tariff rate is going to be significantly higher than it was before, and that sort of changes their strategy and what they're willing to offer, considering that our tariffs before were much lower. So, the UK trade deal hardly moves the needle. Our effective tax rate or tariff rate, if you will, against all of the different countries, China included, is currently about 18%. So that level is higher than anything we've had since the early 1930s. Assuming that all the rates we have right now, 30% on China, 10% on everybody else, stays in effect indefinitely, and that allows businesses time for substitution, we would expect the effective tariff rate to be about 16%, so 2% lower, not significant. And again, that would be the highest tariff rate we've had since the late 1930s. So we'll still be stuck in the 1930s on the tariffs,
What's the
one way or the other.
what's the prevailing economic theory of what 16%, 18% tariff rate? How does that potentially impact consumer spending in the United States? So do goods cost that much more? Because we know this is not something that the other side of the equation, the other countries pay for. They pass this on to American consumers.
Absolutely. So we think of this as overall consumer loss. So at an 18% tariff rate, one estimate suggests that it would be about $2,800 in consumer loss. That is consumers paying more to buy the same items, but also adjusting for the fact that consumers now have fewer goods to choose from, and are buying less than they would have before. So if the ideal consumption rate for you and I to do all these interviews is 6 ties in a year and 10 shirts, then we're going to buy, 4 shirts and 3 ties and pay more for each of those different items. So that $2,800 loss on consumers is taking into account that we're paying more for each item, but also consuming fewer items overall, over a longer period of time. So, and then once the substitutions kick in over a longer period of time, the effective tariff rate is about 16%. Research indicates that that might be about $2,300 consumer loss. So the consumer loss is going to happen one way or the other with the level of tariffs as high as they have been set where they are today, 30% on China and 10% on most of the rest of the world, and still several items at 25% in both Canada and Mexico. So those are still, very significant increase in prices for U.S. consumers, and therefore our economy will be a little bit smaller, even though there will be a marginal increase in manufacturing here in the U.S.
And explain to me how that is winning. How is that good? Because that's going to be the spin that comes out of the White House on this.
Well, I mean, I think so. There will be a little bit of tariff revenue from this. Most of that will be offset, unfortunately, because the economy is going to be smaller, and there are going to have to be bailouts for farmers and various different groups that will lose from retaliatory tariffs. I think, again, the amount of revenue that we will get from a flat 10% tariff against the rest of the world and 30% on China still is dwarfed by the consumer loss, anywhere from $2,300 to $2,800 per household. So consumers are not going to see $2,300 to $2,800 coming to them each year from the U.S. government to make up for the consumer loss from the tariffs. So that one is hard to see as well. I think in the long term, you could make an argument around national security. There are some things that we would like to make here in the United States. Chips and semiconductors, which was a focus of the previous administration and previous Congresses in the last few years with the Chips and Sciences Act and Inflation Reduction Act, to try to get manufacturing of those sensitive items back to the United States. One could argue that we should make more planes, ships, etc. here in the United States. And, we could argue that some of our defense expenditures in those items cost a lot of money because we don't make nearly enough ships. We don't make any ships. We don't build any commercial ships here in the United States. When we go to build Navy ships, it costs a lot more money because we're having to relearn all the things. So one could make arguments around those specific things, but it's hard pressed to say that there is a strong national security argument for me to get my ties and shirts and you to get your ties and shirts from the United States. So again, you know, it's hard to know what the underlying reason is. The different ones have come up: national security. Uh, Another one that comes up is that we have a trade deficit, and those are always bad. People have trade deficits with each other as they buy and sell goods from each other. It's no different. States have trade deficits with other states as we buy and sell goods and services between our states. And then countries have trade deficits between each other. And none of those things are necessarily bad in and of themselves. So that's, another argument that one could make. So our trade deficit would be slightly smaller from this. But again, that is an argument that one can make for this.
So we try to read the tea leaves of the Federal Reserve Bank when they make their official statements after they have their two-day meetings, and Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell comes out and makes comments and takes questions. This was the statement from last, I guess it'd be the week before. Federal Reserve officials are still bracing for economic shock. Should we brace for economic shock?
Well, so I think the economic shock, there was a period of time right after the April 2nd announcement where, almost every economist was thinking there would be a recession by late summer of this year, the level of tariffs as high as they were at that time, which, today the effective rate is 18%. Then it was well over 25%. So that would have been a lot. That would have been a prediction that people were comfortable making then. With the scale backs, this has probably pushed the timeline a little more. We don't at this point have a level of tariffs that is essentially a trade embargo with China, but it's still going to reduce the overall level of goods coming from China. And those prices are going to be passed on to consumers. So consumers, especially as they think about back to school shopping and of those types of things, will consume a lot more Chinese products. Retailers, we've seen in the recent news, indicated they cannot absorb, they were never going to absorb 145% tariff, but they're not going to be able to absorb a 30% tariff as well. They will take a little bit of hit on their profit. Their suppliers have already taken the hit in the past few years, where we've already had tariffs on China. And so consumers are going to see higher prices on those items. And, that means that businesses and consumers are pulling back on spending. That does raise the risk of a recession for this year, from pretty non-existent at the beginning of this year to, a fairly significant chance through this year. Now, again, all of this could change. Those tariffs that we have in place right now could go away, could go lower, but they could also go higher.
Always something to watch in the
Yeah.
economy. Mervin Jebaraj, economist with the University of Arkansas Walton College of Business, got a big quarterly business forecast coming up. So looking forward to hearing what you have to say at that.
Yeah. Good to see you.